This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. 'Tis the season to eat, drink, and be merry. But what is in our food? Who controls our water? This week, Professor Courtney Thomas says our food safety system is woefully antiquated. Professor Karen Piper warns that the world is on the brink of water wars, and that can affect our food supply. And Bill Press talked with Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy about Republican obstruction on protecting Americans' privacy. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. As we sit down to holiday meals, Professor Courtney Thomas tells us about the corporate power and governmental inefficiency that has rendered our food safety programs a century behind the times. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Courtney Thomas is a visiting assistant professor of political science at Virginia Tech University. Her research interests include international political economy, food safety and security, genocide studies, and public policy. Dr. Thomas is currently focusing on food politics and has written a book called In Food We Trust. Dr. Courtney Thomas, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's our pleasure. So what is the state of food safety today, a century after the first laws were passed?
The food safety system in the United States today is woefully antiquated. We have far more outbreaks of food safety illnesses or foodborne illnesses in this country than we should. We have way too many people getting sick. We have far too many hours of worker productivity lost. The food safety system in this country is really a century behind. It's a century behind where it should be or where it could be.
Now, even if we cleaned up farms and food factories in the United States, aren't we still at risk from all the food imported from, say, Central America, China, Southeast Asia?
Certainly. Food imports are definitely a risk. And, every time Congress decides to deal with this issue, it tends to focus its attention on imported foods. And don't get me wrong, there's definitely a risk to imported foods. But there are some things to think about to shift the attention back domestically. The first is that while the United States does import a good amount of its food, it doesn't tend to import the foods that are most concerning in terms of foodborne illnesses. The second thing is that, China has some issues with its food system. It is working to correct those, and that's going to take some time, certainly. But, as they try to make those changes and make those corrections, they are doing it with information from the International Food Safety Association, the Codex Alimentarius Commission. They are trying to make updates to their food system that are in accordance with the best scientific knowledge that is out there. And, we haven't done that. We haven't made that move domestically. And so, yes, imported foods are certainly a risk. But honestly, if you look at the numbers, most of the foodborne illnesses that people contract in the United States, they contract from food that is produced domestically.
You suggest in your book that the difference between the ideal regime of food safety and the reality lies in the political clout that the gigantic food companies have with the government. What are some examples of that?
Okay, so there have been moments in U.S. history, the turn of the 20th century and then a couple of years ago with the passage of the Food Safety Modernization Act, where food companies in this country have realized that it is in their best interest to promote food safety regulation. And at the moment that large food producers realize that it is in their economic interest to promote food safety, either because it helps them to push out of the marketplace competitors who cannot afford to put into place the food safety systems and regimes that are required by law, or because it allows them to pass blame for food safety outbreaks onto the government instead of onto their own companies and their own factories, you see a lot of movement to support food safety legislation from the large agribusinesses. But most of the time, and throughout the entire 20th century, agribusiness in this country made a concerted effort to prevent federal food safety regulation from becoming more appropriate in terms especially of microbial food safety. And so what you see is, and we saw this even in 2011 with the passage of the Food Safety Modernization Act, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, which is one of the largest lobbying groups in this country for the beef industry, put up a huge amount of resistance to the passage of this legislation. And what's so frustrating about that is that the Food Safety Modernization Act doesn't regulate the beef industry. The beef industry is regulated by the USDA. The Food Safety Modernization Act only covered the statutory authority of the Food and Drug Administration. And so even though this legislation was not going to impact them, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association still opposed efforts to update the food safety system, probably because they saw this as a slippery slope to the regulation of their own industry, to the changes in regulation of their own industry. But what you see in this country over time is that food companies don't want federal mandates that they change their practices, even though we know, and we know from international data, we know from our own experiences with companies in this country that have voluntarily imposed the best food safety practices, we know that food safety gives us an economic advantage. It saves us money in the long run. And yet the large food companies have still resisted efforts to regulate the food safety on a national level.
You would think that you would have everything under one department, as opposed to spreading it out. It's the FDA for this, it's somebody else for this, in terms of regulating our food. I don't understand why it would be in different places like that.
Neither does anyone else. But you have to go back, and you really have to go back to the early 20th century to understand what happened there. When the United States passed food safety legislation for the first time in the early 20th century, they were desperately trying to get legislation passed. Their objective was to get something passed, and they had been thwarted, and there had been setbacks just constantly for 20 years of attempts to make this happen that hadn't gone through. And so the real mover and shaker, the father of food safety regulation in the United States, Dr. Wiley, finally was able to push forward two different pieces of legislation to govern two different parts of the food system. The first was the Meat Inspection Act, and that came after Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, and people got an inside view into what meat production in this country really looked like, and it was nauseating and it was terrifying. And that ended up being under the regulation of the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, because the USDA already had relationships with farmers. It already had relationships with meat producers. And so it seemed like it would be logical to give them the authority to implement these new regulations because they already had that social capital invested in the agriculture sector. When the rest of the food safety the food system was regulated, there was actually a new federal agency created, the Department of Chemistry, and that ends up eventually becoming the FDA under a different regulatory framework. And so it goes back to expediency in the early 20th century, and we haven't changed it.
We're speaking with Courtney Thomas, visiting assistant professor of political science at Virginia Tech University. Her wide range of interests, or research interests, including international political economy, food safety and security, genocide studies, public policy. And Dr. Thomas is currently focusing on food politics and has written a book called In Food We Trust. I would think, Doctor, that consumers would like to know who controls our food marketplace. Is it agribusiness or is it the huge supermarket chains?
It's both. There are a very small number of food producers in this country. I love to show a particular graphic that was published, I think it was the Washington Post a couple of years ago, that actually shows all of the different brands and which companies own those. And, Nestle and General Mills and Procter & Gamble, there are very few number of food producers that own just massive numbers of food brands. So to a certain extent, yes, it is the agribusinesses that control most of the country's food supply. But on the other hand, the supermarket chains have an important role to play in this as well, because consumers have a tendency when they get sick from consuming a food to blame two places. They put blame on the supermarket where they purchased the food, or they put blame on the company whose brand is on the product that made them sick. And so supermarket chains have a huge vested interest in making sure that the food that they sell is as safe as possible because they don't want consumers to blame them for a foodborne illness outbreak. You know, one of the biggest problems in this, or it's not really a problem, but it is definitely a reality in this country, is that food sales are pretty much static. Most families don't buy more food this year than they bought last year unless their family size increases. Mm-hmm. So if you want to make money in this industry, you have to do it by capturing consumers to your products and your brands. And food safety is a big part of that process.
Which foods do we commonly eat that are the most subject to contamination?
Fresh produce is a big risk in terms of foodborne illness. Fresh produce has very little post-processing. It's not it's not cooked. And so there's a big risk in terms of food safety for fresh produce, which kind of puts an additional spin on things because, of course, we all here eat more fresh fruits and vegetables. So that's good for our health.
We're creating a rock in a hard place there, right?
It really is, because nutritionally that's certainly true. But in terms of food safety, fresh produce is a major risk. And we've seen outbreaks in recent years with melons and spinach and jalapeno peppers and tomatoes. And one of the biggest risks, and this is something that we really learned after the spinach outbreak in the late 2000s, or 2009, somewhere around there, was that sometimes fresh produce, when it sucks water into the inside of the plant, will carry the contamination. If the contamination is in the water, it will carry the contamination into the inside of the food. And so the spinach that was making people sick was this triple-washed spinach. But it doesn't matter how many times you wash it. If the contamination is on the inside of the plant, there's no way to get it out and still eat the fresh produce. And so fresh produce is a major risk in terms of food safety.
Wow. I just sort of have the feeling you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. You know?
To a large extent, yeah. It's easier when I can talk about things. I mean, beef is a major risk. Ground meats are a risk, things like that. But when you talk about fresh produce, it really does create a conflict of interest between food safety and nutrition.
Mm-hmm. Isn't it true that most people who get food poisoning get it from their own kitchens and their own carelessness in handling raw food, though?
Certainly a lot of people who get sick from cross-contamination in their kitchens. And I think most Americans, and I would count myself among these until I actually started to take coursework in food safety, don't really think about all of the things that they do in their own kitchens that do present a risk as far as foodborne contamination. But here's an important thing to remember. Even if you're going to get sick from food that you're preparing in your own kitchen, the foodborne illness is coming into that kitchen somehow. Salmonella or E. coli or Campylobacter or whatever it is that you're going to get sick from the cross-contamination in your kitchen, it's coming in on a food supply. And so if there's some way to reduce the risk of the food coming into our kitchens in terms of contamination, we can also reduce the risk that people will get sick from their own careless handling of food.
Again, we're speaking with Dr. Courtney Thomas, visiting assistant professor of political science at Virginia Tech University here on americasdemocrats.org, and talking a little bit about her book called In Food We Trust and some of the regulations and the different groups that are handling all the regulations of food. I kind of want to go back to something that you had mentioned earlier and along the lines of this split between Department of Agriculture and Food and Drug Administration. Why is the food safety regulation split between them? And shouldn't there be one agency that regulates all food? And is there a move to perhaps consolidate that?
Well, and again, the split really does come from the early attempts to regulate food safety in this country at the turn of the 20th century. So
right.
1906, we see that split. But the question, should there be one agency that regulates food? That's something that policy experts have talked about for many years. And for a long time, the GAO recommended very strongly that there be one food safety agency in the United States with the sole responsibility to regulate food safety for all food products. And by the way, it's not just the FDA and the USDA. I mean, those are the big ones, but it's also the EPA. It's also the Trade Commission. It's also local health departments. I mean, there are literally dozens of federal and state agencies that have some small part of the food regulatory authority, some small part of this process. But, and this is what's very interesting, the GAO actually backed off of that proposition a few years ago after seeing what happened with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. and attempts to centralize intelligence and national security in a single agency at the federal level. And they realized that there were so many problems with that, and there were so many difficulties in creating that one central agency that they actually backed off of the idea of a single food safety agency and focused their efforts instead on reforming the FDA and the USDA as they currently exist, rather than this idea of creating a whole new separate agency.
Now, there was a new food safety law enacted in 2013, I believe. Is it too soon to tell if that's working?
Yeah, that's the Food Safety Modernization Act, and it was passed in 2011, and yes, it's way too soon to know if that's going to work or what even that is going to mean. It was passed in 2011. It has been through several years now of review, and most people I don't think about this, but when a law is passed by Congress, that's really just the first of many steps. And laws that are passed by Congress are kind of the bare bones of what it is that we want to do in terms of policy. But once Congress passes a law, that legislation goes to the agency, in this case the FDA, and the FDA has to look at the legislation and say, okay, how are we going to do this? How on a practical level are we going to have rules and practices and regulations to put these broad principles into action? And that's what the FDA has been doing over the past couple of years. So even though this legislation was passed several years ago, it hasn't been implemented in its entirety yet. And so there's no way to know what the impacts of that are going to be until we start to see implementation. And on top of that, despite the very best intentions when passing this legislation, one of the things that ended up happening was that it drew a lot from the early 20th century, the 1906 laws. The 1906 laws never classified foodborne bacteria and viruses, E. coli, salmonella, all of those, as adulterants under that framework. It is possible that even though the Food Safety Modernization Act clearly intends to cover foodborne illness, it is possible that because it is not explicitly stated in the legislation, that the federal courts will strike down efforts to do so once that legislation is actually implemented.
That doesn't make any sense.
It was an oversight. I can only assume that it was an oversight, but it's not explicitly there. Oh. And the federal courts have done this before. When there have been efforts, and this was primarily on the part of the USDA, when there were efforts to govern foodborne illness, salmonella was the big one, the federal courts said you can't do it because that exceeds the statutory authority of the USDA in terms of food safety. And because this new legislation does not explicitly say that it is going to treat foodborne illness as an adulterant under the 1906 framework, it is possible that that entire food safety initiative will be declared by the federal courts to be beyond the statutory mandate of the FDA.
I'm left shaking my head.
I do that with frequency.
I guess you do. All right, before we let you go, quick question for the benefit of all consumers. Isn't it true that the pull date on most groceries is meaningless in terms of health, that it's all about how a food tastes after too long on a shelf as opposed to it being bad? Yeah.
Absolutely. The dates that you see on foods, the sell-by dates or the best if used by dates, those are not safety dates. They aren't necessarily even quality dates, depending on how they're being used. They're inventory control dates. Those are put on there by food producers so that the producers and the suppliers can work with the distributors and the supermarket chains to make sure that food is circulating through the system at the rate that they want it to. It is absolutely not a safety. It is not a safety date. It has no connotation for food safety. So I always tell people when you want to know if a food is safe to eat, the three basic rules are: look at it and see if it looks right, smell it and see if it smells right, and taste it and see if it tastes right. And if it looks okay, it smells okay, and it tastes okay, chances are, even if the date says that it's quote-unquote expired, the chances are it's perfectly safe to consume.
And after those three things, if you're still standing, you're probably good to go.
You're
right?
probably okay.
Yeah. Okay. Courtney Thomas, Visiting Assistant Professor of Political Science at Virginia Tech University. Check out her book. It's called In Food We Trust. Dr. Thomas, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again.
Thanks so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. Water expert Karen Piper walks us through the world's water crisis, looming wars over the supply of H2O. We'll talk to her about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Billionaires who invest in hedge funds generally have the ethical and aesthetic sensibilities of dirt clods. As far as they care, fund managers can put their money into skunk pelt futures, as long as the investment pays a super fat return. But since Wall Street's 2008 crash revealed that so many of these investment schemes were based on nothing more than financial cobwebs and fairy dust, some of the clods began seeking hedge funds that would invest in something more down to earth. Thus, Wall Street discovered dirt, more specifically, farmland. Such money handlers as BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, now offer big pieces of America's heartland as an asset that super-rich penthouse dwellers can own and till for mega profits. As a result, ag professors report that their Farm Belt conferences on land economics, which normally draw an audience of farmers and local farm lenders, are dominated these days by Wall Streeters, and American farmland investment seminars are even being held in Dubai and Singapore. But this Wall Street land rush is a flimsy fad, for it's not based on economic realities. While crop prices are at record highs today, the painful historic record is that they will plummet tomorrow, destroying the cash flow that makes the hedge fund investment in land work. Then, of course, the billionaires will rush to shed their overalls. But who will line up to buy the land? Certainly not real farmers who can't afford the inflated Wall Street price, and especially not young people who want to farm but are already finding it hard to locate affordable land. This is Jim Hightower saying America desperately needs this next generation of food producers. Yet we're letting Wall Street speculators literally wall off the land they need. To learn more, contact the National Young Farmers Coalition at youngfarmers.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. 3/4 of the Earth's surface is water. But why are there shortages in the U.S. and around the world? Professor Karen Piper tells us and describes looming water wars and the price of thirst. And we say hello to University of Missouri Professor Karen Piper, whose research focuses on globalization, colonial and neo-colonial discourse, and the rhetoric of development. Her latest book, The Price of Thirst, Global Water Inequality and the Coming Chaos. Professor Karen Piper, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, indeed. You know, we've heard for a long time that water is getting to be in short supply. In fact, we're seeing it on the news almost nightly. How serious is the problem right now?
Well, basically, 20% of people on the planet don't have access to clean water. And the key word here is clean, because there's actually the same amount of water today as there was in the time of dinosaurs. It just circulates around the planet. But the problem is that water is becoming polluted. So while people are still drinking water, they're now drinking dirty water. And then another issue is that we're losing our ancient aquifers, and we're not going to be able to get those back. And then finally, climate change is just making everything worse. So it's not so much a water problem, it's really a people problem.
Is water then a resource like oil or diamonds that could potentially lead to war over access to it?
Good question. Yes, it has actually already led to wars. For instance, the 1957 Arab-Israeli war started over the Jordan River, and there's lots of examples of that. And today in Iraq and Syria, Turkey was cutting off the water supplies of these countries with their dams there, and that led to civil unrest, and now we see ISIS. And most people don't even know about the connection with water supplies, but it's no coincidence that ISIS is focusing on taking over dams.
It's interesting.
So
there's very little mention of water being an issue with any of these things when you're watching the nightly news programs and things like that.
I know it's often like just discussed as a political issue or, an issue of right and wrong. And it would help a lot if people talked about how it was a war over water resources to some extent. So, yeah, it's unfortunate we don't hear about it.
Now, the problem, I guess, it's not one of supply, but distribution then?
Yes. Like I said, there's still the same amount of, there's still the same amount of water in the world, but as water gets polluted, it gets more expensive to treat. And in some cases today, water has become impossible to treat with the current technology that we have. So we are losing our supply in that sense. We're also losing it in the sense that, pumping fossil aquifers actually just increases salt water, because when it rains, that water doesn't go back into these fossil aquifers, it flows to the ocean. And the same thing with melting glaciers. And then also it's the issue of how we've chosen to urbanize the world, because large urban areas require moving rivers. And so there are supply issues involved, but it's a matter of sort of rethinking everything.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with University of Missouri professor Karen Piper. Her latest book is The Price of Thirst, Global Water Inequality and the Coming Chaos. So this water crisis, is it more than about drinking water, water for sanitation? Is it both?
Basically, a sanitation crisis is a water crisis, which is can be hard to wrap your head around. But it's really impossible to separate the two, because when people don't have adequate sanitation, they will often use rivers as toilets, and then this becomes a drinking water crisis downstream. And right now, there's an enormous sanitation backlog in the world. But it's also important to remember that it's more than both of those things, because 70% of the world's water is used for agriculture. So it's also a food crisis, and we have to rethink the way we do agriculture, because as our aquifers dry up, a lot of our food supply will disappear.
This is just a vicious circle. It is what I'm hearing. It's just, wow. Your thesis.
There's lots that needs to be done.
Yeah, obviously. And what's most disturbing is that nobody's really talking about it in these terms. It doesn't seem to be that front burner issue that it probably should be if it's really, if it's this bad.
Yeah, it should be, which is part of the reason I wrote my book.
Mm-hmm. And your thesis is that water has been a weapon of colonialism. What are some examples of that?
Historically, there's many examples of this, from the issue of basically moving indigenous people away from their water supplies as countries were taken over, including in the United States. But also, if you look at a water distribution map in a colonial city, you'll find that water and sanitation facilities were only built for the settlers, but not for the locals. So this creates great inequity, and it keeps people oppressed in these cities. So, and a final example is that in South Africa, water supplies were actually cut off as a way of controlling people, or a form of punishment for protesters who were involved in the anti-apartheid movement.
What about?
So there's all kinds of ways to weaponize water.
Yeah. What about private ownership of water? Should there be private ownership? Should there not be private ownership? If so, who should control the distribution of water?
That's a very complicated question, but I think basically, you have to remember that the corporate goal in controlling water is to make money. So when corporations take over water supplies, they have always raised water rates. And part of the reason is they have to pay extra costs like advertising, campaigns, and taxes, and consumers are paying for that. But also, their goal is to raise the rates as high as they can. And more importantly, I think when we hand control to corporations, we lose power to make decisions about how we distribute water, which has had negative consequences all over the world. So right now, I would definitely fight for public control of water in the United States. We have a great socialized water system in this country that people take completely for granted.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. You mentioned earlier the effects of climate change on the water supply. But a lot of people might sit back and say, well, the melting ice glaciers would increase the world water supply. So what's the problem there?
Yeah, okay, you would think so, right? But it's sort of counterintuitive. But the problem is that as the glaciers melt, they create floods, and that water runs straight to the ocean. So climate change is actually like a machine for producing salt water, which doesn't do people much good. Mm-hmm. So, and then after that flooding, when the glacier is gone completely, the river is gone. So imagine all our rivers drying up. That's what we're looking at. So, it's important to remember that climate change increases salt water, not fresh water. And
we're seeing that certainly in California. You see these pictures of what used to be lakes that are just basically dry beds now, and large rivers that have shrunk down immensely. So that is pretty scary. Why can't desalinization happen? Why is that? Why does that keep us from using ocean water?
Desalinization is too expensive, basically. It's also polluting. It depends on the kind of energy source that you use, but it's highly energy intensive. And so the first desalination plants were oil burning. There's other sources of energy that you can use for them. If you had solar powered desalinization, I'd be totally for that. And we will have to do that to some extent. The problem is we don't have enough energy to supply the amount of water that we are losing. Mm. So it's really just, it's a very small scale replacement.
Mm-hmm. University of Missouri professor Karen Piper's latest book, The Price of Thirst, Global Water Inequality and the Coming Chaos. Professor, we appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We certainly hope we can bring a little bit more attention to this issue and start changing the way that we deal and consider water, especially in this country, but also worldwide. Thank you for being with us, and we look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Okay, this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Senator Patrick Leahy, on the Senate's refusal to take up a bipartisan bill to protect against government snooping.
Big news here out of Washington yesterday. Most of the talk has been about the Keystone Pipeline vote, but there was a much, much more important bill under consideration in the Senate yesterday, and that was the USA Freedom Act, a bill which would reform the practices of the NSA, authored by the senior senator from Vermont, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Patrick Leahy, a good friend who joins us on our news line this morning. Senator, it's an honor to have you with us. How are you?
I always enjoy being with you. I'm well, although they're not too happy about the Republicans blocking the NSA bill last night.
No, indeed. You would think USA Freedom Act, right? How could they vote against it?
Well, and also we had co-sponsors that went from Ted Cruz and Mike Lee to me and Chuck Schumer and just about everybody in between. And the irony is, I think there's a bill that probably would have passed before the elections. And now they don't want it to pass here. They'd rather bring it up next year, but they're going to have more difficulty next year because they're going to be under a timetable where everything expires if they don't act. What we did, we made improvements, and it was frustrating. People said, well, if you put some limitations on who and how we can spy on people, why ISIS will be here next week, or look what happened in Canada, or something like. I mean, the most ridiculous arguments. For one thing, with all the tools they had, nobody in the intelligence community even knew ISIS was coming, nor understood how poorly Iraq's army was set up after we'd spent $2 or $3 trillion in that country, and were able to just walk through, mostly with stolen American military property. And I never heard so much baloney being spewed on the Senate, and I've heard a lot of baloney over the years.
No. Well, Senator, let's be sure that our viewers and listeners understand, how would this have changed the operations of NSA?
It would have put some limits and better oversight on it, so that NSA couldn't just do a blanket, well, let's check everybody's phones and all. I mean, this Bill Press, he comes up with some pretty outrageous things sometimes. He's actually been critical of us. I think we ought to check on him. And especially if he hangs around with that Leahy guy, or even worse, Bernie Sanders. Yeah. And but the thing is, we want limits on this. We believe in our privacy in this country. Can you imagine, when you think back to some of the things the FBI did under J. Edgar Hoover, when they were trying to get Martin Luther King to commit suicide, when they were investigating people who were opposed to the war in Vietnam. If they had had all the equipment the NSA and others have today, I mean, we could have turned this country into a police state. Now, I don't care who is president, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. I want real controls on what our intelligence agencies can do when it involves Americans.
Sure, and you think about those, as you say, Frank Church with his investigation that grew out of those abuses at the time, warned. When you read about his warnings, it's like he warned of exactly what NSA is doing today, right?
He did, and in fact, I'm glad you mentioned Frank Church, who is a hero and a mentor of mine. The very first vote I cast in the United States Senate as a 34-year-old senator back in 1975 was to create the Church Committee.
Really?
And there were those like John Stennis in the Armed Services who said, we don't want that because we don't want to know what these people are doing. Now, I just spent 8 years as a prosecutor. I want to know what they're doing. When I came in as a prosecutor, I made very strict orders for law enforcement. You're going to have to follow the rules. You're going to have to protect people's rights. They're reluctant at first. Later, they realized it was a lot better for everybody because their own credibility increased. But what Frank Church found were all these secret things going on that were against our own Constitution. That if the American people knew about it, they would be totally opposed to it, but they were kept in the dark. What I'm saying is, let's make sure we stay secure as a nation, and we will. We're the most powerful nation on earth. But part of that power is that we protect the rights of every single American. And the right of privacy is a major one. and the ability of government to just destroy somebody if they want should not be allowed under our Constitution.
Now, Senator, there used to be this phrase, I remember, the reconsideration. Is there any possibility you can bring this bill back for another try before the end of the year?
Technically, yes. As a practical matter, no, because the votes are such. We talked about that last night, and Harry Reid could have voted against it so he could move to reconsider, but it was very clear that we were not going to have the votes. That
right.
Some of the people who agree with me in principle did not dare go against the Republican leader on this, which is too bad, because he gave a speech about, we need all this for ISIS on the floor. So I stood up and I said, well, would you have time to answer a couple questions about what you just read, most of which was wrong? He said, no, I'm very busy. I don't have time right now. I have never, ever seen any leader, Republican or Democrat, do that in the 40 years I've been there.
What happened to Senate courtesy, right, or common courtesy in that case? How did you deal with a senator? I thought for you would have Rand Paul's vote, if anybody's vote, on this, and
I did too. And Paul would like to do away with the whole act. I told him that's not going to happen. There are things in there that have checks and balances, and we should keep. But I think that, he has taken a purist view where he will never get to vote on what he says he wants, so he can just vote no.
So vote no on everything, right. Yeah. So you had Mitch McConnell on one side and Rand Paul on the other side. Hard to navigate between the two of those. I'm going to ask you this, Senator. Would you even have had this bill, would we even have this hearing if we did not have the revelations of Edward Snowden, or documents released by Edward Snowden?
I think that the documents released allowed build up some of the momentum in the public. If this bill was set out to a vote around the country, I think it would pass easily. But a lot of us had raised these same questions that Snowden had and got no answers. After it came out, we got more. I'll give you one example. The head of the NSA said that we needed all this collection because it stopped 54 terrorist attacks. They'd do this in speeches all over in PowerPoints and so on.
Right.
So I said, well, look, let's have a public hearing on this. Brought him before it, where, of course, you have to tell the truth and face very serious consequences. Well, the 54 came down to 15. It came down to 12. It came down to, we did involve it in one case after the FBI had begun an investigation. So 54 went to after the fact 1. And yet, but then their next thing, and this is what I kept raising, they said, don't worry about America's privacy and America's rights, because we keep very tight control on all this material. I said, such tight control that a 29-year-old subcontractor was able to walk away with every bit of it. I said, that just doesn't work. Yeah. And this is why around the world now we're finding companies like Google and IBM and everybody else that have these international footprints. They're being shunned by other countries because they don't trust them because of what our agencies have done. And I don't know, I find it so frustrating. The sky is falling kind of.
You hear it all the time, right?
Well, back 13 years ago this month, an envelope that was addressed to me that I was supposed to open was finally found and opened. One person who touched it died. It was had so much deadly anthrax in it. So it's not as though I'm here in a naive position. when I was a prosecutor, I had people escape from prison with the intent of killing me. I'm not naive about this, but I also look at all that was done, even on the anthrax, and then they never got all the people that were involved.
Yeah. Now, I got to tell you, Senator, I think very, very important legislation. It may be our best shot at reforms of the NSA for some time. You fought the good fight. I'm sorry you didn't get that extra. For the American people, for all of us, I'm sorry you didn't get those extra 2 votes. But it's very kind of you, in the light of that, to take some time for us this morning, Senator, as always.
Well, Bill, I love your program, and I was happy to do it.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Senator Patrick Leahy, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, ranking the senior Democrat from the state of Vermont. And, of course, his colleague is our other good friend, Senator Bernie Sanders.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Courtney Thomas, Karen Piper, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.